Sometimes the most profound moments in life arrive quietly without fanfare or announcement. They come wrapped not in grand gestures or romantic declarations, but in simple actions that reveal the true measure of a person's character. This is the story of Sarah and Michael, a narrative about what happens when one person's vulnerability meets another person's unwavering commitment. It is a story about the kind of love that doesn't make headlines, but changes lives forever. In a world that constantly demands we be strong, be perfect, be enough on our own, their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest strength lies in asking for help, and that true power is found in someone showing up when it matters most. What you are about to read is not a fantasy. It happened on ordinary days in an ordinary life, but in ways that proved to be absolutely extraordinary. Sarah sat in the parking lot of her office building for 15 minutes before she had the courage to turn off the engine. Her hands trembled against the steering wheel as she stared at the glass doors reflecting the afternoon sunlight. Inside those doors, people were working, laughing, moving through their day with the kind of confidence she had not felt in months. She wondered if anyone looking at her face would be able to see what was happening beneath the surface. The constant ache, the weight pressing down on her chest, the voice in her head that kept telling her she was failing at everything that mattered. At 34 years old, Sarah had built what many people would consider a successful life. She was a marketing director at a well-respected firm, earned a comfortable salary, maintained a small but well-decorated apartment in the city, and had friendships she valued. Yet none of this seemed to matter much anymore. For the past 8 months, she had been wrestling with depression that came from a place she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the result of a specific tragedy or loss. There was no clear before and after moment she could point to and say, that's when everything changed. Instead, it was more like a slow erosion, as if something inside her had gradually stopped working the way it was supposed to. The medication her doctor prescribed helped take the edge off the worst days, but it didn't solve the fundamental problem. She felt fundamentally broken. She felt like she was pretending to be fine while everything inside was collapsing. Every morning required an enormous effort just to get out of bed. Every workday felt like a performance where she had to smile and nod and contribute ideas in meetings while internally questioning why she bothered getting up at all. The worst part was the loneliness of it, the sense that if she told anyone how she really felt, they would either run away or pity her, and both options felt equally unbearable. Michael had been her friend for 7 years. They met through a mutual friend at a college reunion. And despite the fact that they lived in the same city, they had managed to maintain their friendship through the typical cycles of adult life, busy periods when they only texted occasionally, followed by phases where they would see each other weekly. Michael was steady in a way that Sarah envied. He worked as a software engineer, had the kind of calm demeanor that came from someone who knew himself well, and he had never seemed to want anything from her except her presence. Their friendship had always been easy, undemanding. But somewhere along the way, in the space between ordinary conversations about work and life, Sarah had started to feel something more than friendship. She hadn't acted on it or said anything about it, convinced that if she revealed this to him, she would lose the most stable relationship in her life. So she kept it to herself. And when she started struggling with depression, Michael was one of the few people she tried to maintain a normal facade with. 3 weeks ago, Sarah had been having a particularly difficult evening. She was sitting on her couch scrolling through her phone, not really looking at anything, just moving her thumb mechanically because it was easier than sitting alone with her thoughts. Michael had texted her, "Haven't heard from you in a while. Want to grab coffee this weekend?" She had stared at that message for a long time. The thought of getting ready, going somewhere, and pretending to be normal felt impossible. But she also knew that if she said no, Michael might stop trying. So she forced herself to respond, "Sure, sounds good." They met at their favorite coffee shop near the waterfront on a Saturday morning. Sarah had spent an hour doing her makeup and selecting clothes, trying to construct a version of herself that looked like everything was fine. She ordered a latte she didn't want and sat across from Michael in one of the small wooden booths by the window. Michael had looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that nobody else in her life had said. "You look exhausted, like really exhausted. Are you okay?" Sarah had felt something crack inside her chest at those words. She wanted to say yes, to deflect, to laugh it off and change the subject. Instead, she felt tears start to build behind her eyes. She sat there trying not to cry in the middle of a public coffee shop, her throat tight, unable to speak. "Sarah?" Michael leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle. "What's going on?" It took her several minutes before she could speak. She talked about the depression, about the medication, about the feeling of being broken, about how every day felt like she was pretending to be someone who had it together when in reality she was falling apart. She told him about the mornings when getting out of bed felt impossible, about the way her mind would spiral into loops of self-criticism, about the shame of feeling this way when objectively her life should feel fine. Michael listened without interrupting. He didn't try to fix her or offer solutions or tell her to look on the bright side. He just listened. And when she finally stopped talking, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I believe you," he said. "I believe that you're struggling, and I believe that it's real. And I want you to know that you're not alone in this." She had gone home from that coffee shop feeling slightly less heavy, not fixed, not suddenly better, but less alone. And in the days that followed, Michael started checking in more often. He would text asking how she was doing. He would suggest they grab lunch. He seemed to have decided that she needed consistent support, and he was going to be the person who provided it. But as weeks passed, Sarah realized something was changing in her. The attention Michael was giving her, combined with her existing feelings for him, was creating a complicated emotional tangle. She found herself looking forward to his messages too much, interpreting small gestures as signs that maybe he felt something romantic too. She was beginning to emotionally depend on him in a way that felt dangerous, because if his feelings didn't match hers, she would not only lose his support, she would also lose her friend. This realization terrified her. It made her start to withdraw slightly, trying to protect herself by creating distance. She responded to his messages less enthusiastically. She declined a couple of his invitations. She tried to convince herself that she could handle her depression on her own, that she didn't need anyone, that depending on someone else for emotional support was weakness. One evening, about 2 months after that coffee shop conversation, she was sitting alone in her apartment staring at her phone. She had a message from Michael asking if she wanted to come over for dinner. She had been declining his invitations for the past week. Her depression had gotten worse again, which happens sometimes, a step backward after periods of slight improvement, and she didn't have the energy to see anyone. But this time, instead of declining, she did something different. Instead of making an excuse or saying she was busy, she told him the truth. "I'm struggling again. I feel like I'm falling back down into it. I know I haven't been responding to you well, and I'm sorry. I think I'm pushing you away because I'm scared." There was a pause of about 20 minutes before Michael responded. Sarah felt her stomach tighten, imagining all the reasons why he might not answer. Perhaps she had finally revealed too much, finally been too much of a burden. Then his message came through. "I'm coming over. Don't worry about anything. I'm just coming over." When Michael arrived at her apartment 30 minutes later, he was carrying groceries. He went directly to her kitchen without waiting for her to invite him in, and he began preparing dinner. Sarah sat at her small kitchen table watching him move around with a quiet competence, chopping vegetables, browning meat, doing simple things with a focused attention that somehow made everything feel less desperate. "I need to tell you something," he said while he was cooking, his back to her as he stirred something in a pan. "I know you've been pulling away from me. I know you've been pulling away from me. But I need you to understand something. I'm not going anywhere, not because I expect anything from you, not because I'm hoping for something in return, but because I care about you. And people who care about each other show up for each other."
"That's just what we do."
Sarah felt tears start again, but this time they felt different. Not tears of despair, but tears of release, as if something she had been holding too tightly was finally being allowed to exist outside of her. "I have feelings for you," she whispered, "and I'm terrified that if I tell you that, you'll run away or it will ruin everything." Michael turned around and looked at her, and there was something in his expression that made her pause. It wasn't the expression of someone who was shocked or uncomfortable. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for her to say this. "I know you do," he said. "I've known for a while. And Sarah, that's not the problem. The problem was that you were carrying all of this alone, thinking you couldn't ask for help, thinking that needing someone was a weakness. But it's not. It's the most human thing in the world." He turned back to the stove and finished cooking dinner. They ate together at her small kitchen table, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt something shift inside her. Not a complete healing, not a magical transformation, but a genuine loosening of the grip that depression had on her. She felt seen. She felt believed. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do this alone. That night, after dinner was finished and they were cleaning up together, Michael said something that would become foundational to everything that followed. I can't fix your depression. No one can do that for you. But I can be here while you're fixing it. I can show up. I can listen. I can remind you on the hard days that you're worth the fight. That's what I can do. And I'm asking you to let me do it. Sarah looked at this man who had suddenly become the most important person in her world, and she realized that she had been asking the wrong question all along. She had been asking herself whether she was worthy of love, whether she was too broken to deserve support, whether asking for help was weakness. But Michael had just answered a completely different question, not whether she was worthy, but whether he was willing. And his answer was unequivocally yes. The weeks that followed that evening in Sarah's apartment were not a linear journey toward happiness or recovery. Instead, they became a complicated dance of progress and setback, hope and despair, moments of genuine connection interrupted by the grey fog that still threatened to pull her under. But there was a fundamental difference now. She was no longer navigating this alone. Michael made a quiet decision that changed everything. Without making it dramatic or announcing it like he was doing something extraordinary, he began to structure his life around being available to Sarah in the way she needed. He wasn't intrusive or overbearing. He didn't try to manage her medication or tell her she should think more positively or any of the well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful things that people often do when someone they care about is suffering. Instead, he became a consistent presence that communicated one simple message through his actions. You matter, and your well-being matters to me. This looked different depending on what Sarah needed on any given day. On the mornings when the depression was particularly heavy and she called him at 7 in the morning, unable to articulate what was wrong, Michael would arrive at her apartment with coffee and sit with her in silence for an hour before work. He didn't ask her to talk or explain herself. Sometimes they would sit on her couch and watch old episodes of a comedy show neither of them particularly cared about. Sometimes he would just sit there while she slept, his presence itself being enough. On the days when she felt slightly more functional, Michael would suggest they go for walks. These weren't the kind of walks where he pretended to be a therapist and tried to analyze her feelings or solve her problems. They were just walks where they would move through the world together, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence. And the simple act of being outside and moving seemed to shift something in Sarah's brain chemistry in ways that no conversation ever could. He learned her patterns. He learned that her depression was often worse on Tuesday mornings for reasons she couldn't explain. Possibly a Monday hangover of accumulated small stresses. Possibly something biological about how her medication worked. Possibly nothing that made logical sense at all. But he learned it, and on Tuesday mornings he would check in more frequently. He would make sure they had plans for that evening. He was quietly strategic about helping her get through the days he knew would be harder. There was something about Michael's approach that was different from everyone else in Sarah's life. Her parents, when she finally told them about her depression, responded with concern and love, but also with a kind of panic, as if her mental illness was a problem that needed to be solved immediately, as if there was something they were missing that would explain why their daughter was struggling. Her co-workers, when she took a few mental health days, treated her with a careful politeness that made her feel like she had revealed something shameful that changed how they saw her. Her other friends, the ones she had told, responded with sympathy but also with a certain distance, as if depression was something contagious that they needed to be careful about. Michael's response was different. He treated her depression like it was a thing she was dealing with, not a thing she was. She was still Sarah, the woman he had been friends with for years, the person he cared about, the person who deserved his support. The depression was just something that made the journey harder, and he was there to help her walk the path regardless of how difficult it became. 3 months into their intensified friendship, or whatever it was that existed between them now, Sarah had to make a decision about work. Her company was offering voluntary layoffs to reduce staff, and there was a financial incentive to take it. Normally, Sarah would have clung to her job as evidence that her life was working. If she lost that, what would she have? But her job was also a source of constant stress, meetings that drained her energy, a workload that often felt unmanageable, and an environment where she was constantly measuring herself against colleagues and coming up short. She sat with Michael at his apartment on a Sunday afternoon, spreading out her finances on his coffee table, trying to calculate whether she could survive a few months without income while she figured out what came next. The numbers looked terrifying when she tried to do it alone, but as they worked through it together with Michael asking questions and helping her think through various scenarios, The fear became more manageable. "What would you want to do if you had freedom from this job?" Michael asked. "Not what you think you should do. Not what would look good, but what would actually make you feel like your life was meaningful." Sarah thought about this for a long time. She had spent so many years focused on being successful, on building a career that looked impressive, that she wasn't entirely sure anymore what she actually wanted. But sitting there with Michael, with the possibility of a different path opening up in front of her, she realized something. She had always wanted to work with people rather than just managing marketing campaigns. She wanted to do something that felt directly connected to helping others. She wondered if she could do some kind of counseling or social work, something that would let her use her pain to help others who were suffering. "So look into that," Michael said simply. "Take the severance. Get some breathing room. Figure out what training you would need, and I will help you figure out how to afford it. That's what we do for people we care about." Sarah took the severance. She left her job on a Friday in late spring, and when she walked out of that building for the last time, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Not the false hope that comes from thinking everything will magically become perfect, but the real hope that comes from recognizing that change is possible and that she has at least one person in her corner who believes in her. The next phase of her journey involved returning to school, not for a full degree, but for certification as a peer counselor and mental health advocate. It was a 6-month program that required commitment and study and effort, and there were days when Sarah wanted to quit, convinced that she was too damaged to help anyone else, too broken to be trusted with other people's pain. On those days, Michael would remind her why she was doing this. He would sit at her kitchen table while she practiced her counseling responses, playing the role of client while she learned to listen without trying to fix. He would listen to her practice presentations. He would be there at 3 in the morning when she couldn't sleep because she was anxious about an exam the next day. But more importantly, Michael did something else that Sarah hadn't expected. He allowed her to practice on him. One evening, after she had been in her program for about 3 months, he sat down with her and asked her to listen to him the way her counseling instructor had taught her to listen. "I have something I need to tell you," Michael said, and Sarah could see that he was nervous. "And I need you to listen without judgment, without trying to solve it, without offering advice unless I ask for it. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded, taking on the role of counselor, and Michael began to talk about his own struggles, things she had never known about him. He talked about how he had always been the person people relied on, the steady one, the competent one. He talked about how exhausting it could be to be that person all the time, to never feel like he could show vulnerability or admit that he didn't have everything figured out. He talked about how, over the years, he had built walls around his own emotions to protect himself and others from having to deal with his needs. "But then you came into my life again," he said, "and watching you work so hard to accept help, watching you be brave enough to ask for support and let yourself be vulnerable, it changed something for me. It gave me permission to be vulnerable too. So I'm telling you that I'm not just here for you out of goodness or obligation. I'm here because I need this too. I need to be someone who shows up for people I care about. I need to be someone who can express love through action. It's actually helping me as much as I'm helping you." Sarah found herself in an unfamiliar position. She was the one listening, the one offering support, the one being strong for someone else, and she realized that this was perhaps the greatest gift Michael could have given her. By allowing her to support him, he gave her back her sense of agency and purpose. He showed her that she wasn't just a person receiving help. She was a person capable of giving it too. The line between friendship and romantic love blurred during this time, though neither of them tried to make it official or define it. Sometimes Michael would stay at her apartment during difficult nights, and they would fall asleep on her couch with his arm around her shoulder. Sometimes they would kiss, and then pull back because they both knew that rushing into anything while she was still healing from depression would be a mistake. They existed in this in-between space where they were more than friends but not quite acknowledged as something else, and somehow that felt exactly right. What was clear, though, was that Michael's response to Sarah's simple request for support had been to remake his understanding of what love meant. He had learned that love wasn't a grand gesture or a romantic declaration. Love was showing up on a Tuesday morning when someone was struggling. Love was making dinner without being asked. Love was sitting with someone in their pain without trying to fix it. Love was believing in someone even when they didn't believe in themselves. Love was allowing yourself to be vulnerable so that the person you care about knows they're not alone in their struggle. By the end of that summer, Sarah had completed her certification program. She had started working part-time at a community mental health center, doing peer support and counseling. She still had difficult days. The depression didn't disappear, and her medication remained part of her daily routine. But there was a fundamental shift in her relationship to the struggle. She was no longer fighting alone. She was no longer ashamed of needing help. She had learned that strength wasn't about never falling apart. It was about letting someone help you put the pieces back together. And Michael, who had simply chosen to show up when she needed someone most, had become the most important person in her life. Not because he had saved her, but because he had believed she could save herself and had been there to witness and support that process every step of the way. By the time winter arrived that year, Sarah had been working at the Community Mental Health Center for 4 months. The work was difficult in ways she hadn't anticipated, but it was also deeply fulfilling. She spent her days listening to people who were struggling with their own versions of the darkness she knew well. People fighting depression, anxiety, addiction, trauma, grief. She would sit with them in their pain and share her own story, not as someone who had conquered her struggles, but as someone who was still learning how to live alongside them. She was particularly drawn to clients who reminded her of where she had been. Adults who felt broken and alone, who believed that their mental illness disqualified them from being worthy of love or support. When these clients would sit across from her and tell her their stories, she would listen with a depth of understanding that came from having lived through similar experiences. She could validate their pain not as a professional offering comfort, but as a human being saying, "I know what this is. I have felt it too. And I am still here. Still fighting, still alive. So can you." One of her supervisors eventually pulled her aside and said something that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "You have a gift for this work. The clients feel that you truly understand them because you do. That authenticity is something you can't teach. And it's what makes people want to keep fighting." Michael would come to her work and pick her up sometimes, and he would wait in the community center's reception area while she finished up with her last client of the day. Occasionally, one of her clients would see them leave together, Michael with his hand on the small of her back or Sarah leaning her head against his shoulder, and they would say something like, "You two look happy. You give me hope that maybe good things can happen to people like us." What struck Sarah about these moments was that no one who said this knew the full story. They didn't know about the dark mornings or the medication or the therapy sessions or the times when Sarah had wanted to give up entirely. They just saw the external evidence of her survival, that she was still here, still functioning, still capable of experiencing something that looked like happiness. And their hope at seeing her was a kind of reciprocal gift. By surviving and continuing to try, she gave them permission to do the same. At Thanksgiving that year, Michael did something that seemed small but felt monumental. He suggested that instead of spending the holiday with their respective families, they spend it together. He proposed that they cook an elaborate meal for two, that they spend the day talking about everything they were grateful for, and that they use it as an opportunity to acknowledge the past year and how far Sarah had come. They spent that Thursday moving around Michael's kitchen, in a kind of dance they had developed over months of cooking together. Sarah chopping vegetables while Michael managed multiple pots on the stove, their movements synchronized in a way that required no verbal communication. They worked on a turkey that Michael had insisted on despite Sarah's protests that it was too ambitious for just 2 people. They made an elaborate stuffing from scratch, multiple side dishes, and a dessert that required hours of preparation. As they worked, Sarah found herself thinking about how different this felt from how she had imagined spending her Thanksgiving just a year ago. A year prior, she had been isolated in her apartment, trying to convince herself that it mattered whether she showed up at her family's dinner or not. Now she was spending the day with the person who had transformed her life, not through grand gestures, but through consistent, patient, loving presence. "I have something I want to say," Michael announced once they were sitting down to eat, "and I want you to hear me out before you respond." Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. She had learned by this point that Michael sometimes had important conversations he wanted to have, and that he approached them with deliberation. She put down her fork and gave him her full attention. "I love you," he said, and Sarah felt her breath catch. Not as a friend. Not as someone who felt obligated to help you. "I love you as someone I want to spend my life with. I have for a while, probably since before you even told me that you had feelings for me. But I wasn't going to tell you that until I was sure you were in a place where you could hear it and believe it. not as something you owed me in return, but as a simple expression of truth about how I feel. Sarah felt tears start immediately, spilling over her cheeks before she could even process what was happening. "I'm not asking you to say it back," Michael continued. "I'm not asking you for anything except to know that there is at least one person in this world who sees you completely, sees your darkness and your light, sees your struggle and your strength, and chooses you anyway. Not because you've earned it or proven yourself or finally become the perfect version of yourself, but because I believe you are inherently worthy of love, exactly as you are right now." Sarah couldn't speak. She got up from her seat and moved around the table to where Michael was sitting, and she kissed him in a way that she hadn't before. Not tentatively, not carefully, but fully, without reservation, with her entire being communicating what she felt but couldn't yet put into words. "I love you too," she finally said. "I think I might have loved you since the moment you showed up at my apartment with groceries and refused to let me push you away. I love you because you taught me what love actually looks like. You taught me that it's not about grand gestures, it's about showing up. It's about believing in someone even when they don't believe in themselves. It's about being willing to sit with someone in their pain instead of running away from it." Over the following months, their relationship deepened in the way relationships do when they're built on a foundation of genuine support and authentic vulnerability rather than fantasy or idealization. They moved in together the following spring, not as a dramatic romantic gesture, but as a practical decision that made sense. Sarah had her good days and her bad days. The depression didn't disappear. She continued therapy, continued her medication, continued to have to work consciously at managing her mental health. But having Michael there, having someone who understood the nature of what she was dealing with, and who didn't expect it to simply go away, made the ongoing management possible. What was most transformative, though, was not what Michael did for Sarah, but what Sarah began to do for herself as a result of believing that she was worthy of love and support. She started advocating more fiercely for her own needs. She started setting boundaries with people who drained her energy. She became more confident in her work, eventually taking on a supervisory role at the mental health center. Training other peer counselors, she reconnected with her family from a place of strength rather than desperation. A year after Michael's Thanksgiving confession, Sarah was at work when she received a call from a woman named Janet, whose daughter was a client at the center. Janet was calling to thank Sarah for something her daughter had said, that Sarah had given her permission to ask for help, that seeing Sarah being honest about her struggles and still managing to build a meaningful life had made Janet's daughter believe that recovery was possible.
"I just wanted you to know," Janet said over the phone, "that you changed my daughter's trajectory."
By being willing to be vulnerable, by showing her that someone could struggle with mental illness and still deserve love and still have a full life, you gave her hope. So thank you. Thank you for being brave enough to be broken in front of her. Sarah hung up the phone and cried, not sad tears, but tears of recognition. She realized that Michael had given her more than just love and support. By believing in her and showing up for her, he had given her the foundation to help others. By allowing her to accept support, he had allowed her to eventually provide support to people who desperately needed to see that survival and healing were possible. That evening, she told Michael about the call. He smiled in that quiet way he had, the way that communicated that he wasn't surprised, that he had always known she was capable of this kind of impact. "This is what happens when someone chooses to love generously," he said. "The ripple effects extend far beyond just the two of us. Your healing is touching people you don't even know. That's the actual power of what happened between us." 2 years after Sarah had made that first simple request, telling Michael that she was scared, that she was struggling, that she needed help, they got married. It was a small wedding with close friends and family, and the reception was held at the community mental health center where Sarah worked, because both of them wanted to celebrate in a place that had become meaningful to Sarah's life. During the reception, Sarah's co-workers approached her with kind words and congratulations. One of her supervisors, a woman named Dr. Patterson, who had mentored Sarah significantly, pulled her aside and said something that Sarah would carry with her forever. "I've been doing this work for 30 years, and I've learned that the most powerful mental health advocates are the ones who are willing to be honest about their own struggles. You're going to change people's lives because you've been willing to let yours change you. That's the real victory here. Not that you found love, though that's wonderful. The victory is that you refuse to let your depression define the entirety of your identity, and now you're giving other people permission to do the same. Michael's response to Sarah's simple request for support had been to transform not just her life, but to create ripples of healing that extended to dozens of people she would encounter in her work. But perhaps more importantly, he had modeled something essential about what it means to be human, that our greatest strength doesn't lie in being self-sufficient or in never needing anyone. Our greatest strength lies in our willingness to show up for people, to believe in them, and to hold space for their transformation, without needing to be thanked or rewarded for it. Years later, Sarah would write a book about her experience with depression and recovery, and she would dedicate it to Michael. The dedication read, "To Michael, who understood that loving someone isn't about fixing them. It's about witnessing their struggle, believing in their capacity to heal, and showing up every single day with the quiet conviction that they are worth the effort." That book would go on to help thousands of people who are struggling with their own mental health issues. It would give them permission to ask for help, to be vulnerable, to believe that their lives were worth fighting for. But none of that would have happened if Michael hadn't made the choice to respond to Sarah's simple request with everything he had. This is the heart of what it means to be human at our best. It's not about being perfect or having all the answers. It's about being willing to show up for people who are suffering. It's about believing in someone's worth even when they can't see it themselves. It's about understanding that love, at its most fundamental level, is an action verb. It's a choice we make every single day to prioritize someone else's well-being, to sit with them in their darkness, and to never stop believing that the light will come again. Sarah eventually became someone who told this story to others, to her clients, to people she met, to audiences when she began speaking about mental health awareness. She always emphasized the same point. I didn't need someone to save me. I needed someone to believe that I could save myself. And sometimes, that belief is enough to change everything. Michael never sought credit or recognition for his role in Sarah's recovery. He continued to work as a software engineer, living a quiet life, showing up for people who needed him, believing that consistency and presence were more important than grand gestures. He became, in his way, a model for what it means to love someone unconditionally, not with the expectation of being rewarded, not with the need to be celebrated, but simply because that person mattered and their well-being was important. This is a true story about two ordinary people who did extraordinary things. It's not a story with a perfect ending where everything is resolved and nothing is ever difficult again. Sarah still has to manage her depression. Michael still struggles with the weight of being the person others rely on. But what they have is something stronger than an absence of struggle. They have each other. They have the knowledge that they are worthy of being loved and supported. And they have the understanding that sometimes the most profound acts of love are the simplest ones. A simple request and a response that changed everything. That's the lesson this story teaches. We never know when one person's willingness to show up might transform another person's entire life. We never know when saying yes to someone who needs us might become the catalyst for their healing. We never know how far the ripples of love will extend when we choose to give it generously.